Adam and Eve ate the fruit of the garden, and by this sin, we are all made to suffer. But why do we call this a sin? What is so wrong with eating a piece of fruit? And are we so sure that this is a sin? I mean, Scripture itself says that they were tricked. And so then why are we all being punished for what they did? We'll talk about that next. But first, as always, we start with our mission.
Always remember, God created us for this time and for this place. If we learn this faith, if we live this faith, if we share this faith, what will the next 100 years look like? Join the mission.
It's not like Eve was knowingly sinning. She says, hey, eat this apple, and he goes, fine. And why does she do that? Because some serpent told her not just eat the apple, but that she was being lied to about the nature of the... In other words, it doesn't sound like somebody sinning. I find it difficult to hold even them morally culpable for this, let alone us. This seems egregious.
The Catechism teaches in number 1857 that there are 3 conditions for a sin: that the act is a grave matter, that the individual committing the act had full knowledge, and that he gave deliberate consent to his actions. If all 3 of these conditions are met, then the act would be sin in the highest degree, what Catholics term as a mortal sin. Now, if only 2 of these conditions are met, it may lessen the culpability of the individual, what we call venial sin. For both Adam and Eve, Scripture teaches that all 3 of these conditions are met. It is a grave matter to disobey a command of God. They fully knew that they were doing something that God had forbidden them, and they acted with full and deliberate consent, as they were not forced to eat the fruit, and there was no necessity for them to do so, and they could have chosen to do otherwise. But in a recent video, the cosmic skeptic, Alex O'Connor, would seem to object to all 3 of these. Firstly, as if it were not a grave matter to disobey God, since perhaps the narrative describes the serpent as having an equal authority as God. They were not being disobedient to God so much as they were being obedient to the serpent. Secondly, that they did not have full knowledge, since the serpent provided them with confusing information. And thirdly, that they did not act with full consent on the grounds that they were tricked. Yet after excusing Adam and Eve, he finds cause to blame God.
And here we're talking about a sin that your grandfather didn't even really commit. He was sort of deceived into doing so. This to me seems somewhat analogous to the story that you're giving me of the fool. And I think that if I were doing that, I should be arrested, thrown in jail, or at the very least, reproached by my fellow human beings.
In this video, I will attempt to answer each of these objections, because if one does not grasp who we are and where we come from, then one cannot hope to grasp further theological concepts that ultimately flow from these truths. For example, Alex has famously challenged Christians to respond to the apparent dilemma of the sincere atheist who pursues God but can't find him. This misunderstanding might actually apply for the simple reason that maybe the sincere atheist is not looking for the true God who is innocent, but some strange God, a God who is guilty. If you are looking for a triangle with 4 sides, you'll never find it, no matter how sincere you are. Not because triangles don't exist, but because your understanding of triangles is incorrect. Regarding the fall of man, Alex seems to misunderstand both God and man, that God is guilty and man is innocent. So first, what do we mean by sin? The commands of God, are they arbitrary, or is there some reason behind why God commands us to do this and not to do that? This is a distinction that is often referred to as necessity of precept and necessity of means. And while I agree that this is an important question, it is too easy to get bogged down here and miss the overall point. So I think it's enough to say that both can be true at the same time. We should follow God's commands simply because He commanded us to do so. And since He is God, it's an act of justice to be obedient to Him. While at the same time, the result then of doing so will be our own good. Why? Because God's will is providential. I mean, it's oriented towards an end, a final purpose. We see this analogously in nature when we see an apple tree working year-round so as to produce apples. The end is the purpose. We have a purpose, and God, who created us, has designed us, like the apple tree, to be oriented towards that purpose, towards that end. But what an apple tree doesn't have, that we do have,
And what is it that's now transmitted to the rest of us because of it?
is a disordering called concupiscence, whereas we work against our end. Simply put, that's what sin is, when we circumvent the will of God in an act that thwarts our final purpose. Father Basil Cole states, sin, grave or light, is the choosing of a good, either of the senses, such as food or money, or of the spirit, such as self-adulation, seeking honors, or sadness of others' gifts and success, that is not in accord with reason and faith. In other words, an incomplete good that is not ordered towards our final end. To be clear, to be tempted is not to sin. We are attracted to this or that by nature. God created us to be attracted to the things around us for our good, insofar as they aid us in reaching our end. These attractions are governed by our higher powers. This is the basis of virtue, whereas vice is the habit of not governing these attractions. This governing of the passions was far easier for Adam and Eve than it is for us today, because they were created in a state of integrity. Now, I discussed this original state in greater detail in a video called Preternatural Gifts, and I'll link it below. But to understand this integrity properly, we need to have a grasp on the concept of hierarchy. Think here of a waterfall. The water originates from its source and falls down over the edge and travels to its destination. God is the source and Adam was the destination. Because he is properly subordinate to God, he is able to catch, to receive everything that flowed down to him from that source, flowing in an order properly to him. That order flows from higher to lower, from God to him. Then the hierarchy continues in his very being within him, first through the soul and then to the body. And in the soul, first through the higher rational powers and then to the lower passions. Because Adam and Eve were created in perfection, this is the state in which they lived. When the serpent approached them to tempt them, this is the state that they were in that their lower passions were subordinate to their higher reasoning. The governing of their lower passions by their higher faculties was functioning properly, perfectly. This effectively means that they would not be immediately coerced by appealing to their passions. So, let's say cigarettes, alcohol, fast food, donuts, those would not have appealed to them. They would have rejected these things from their use of reason in full awareness that these things were potentially deadly. In other words, they could not easily or unwittingly be tempted in their passions. And remember, their use of reason also operated in this hierarchical order, so we cannot infer any type of disorder such as ignorance or stupidity upon them. They knew what they were supposed to know, what God created them to know. Since they were created as adults without parents, without teachers, we understand that they had some kind of infused knowledge, to the extent that they knew everything that was necessary for them to know in order for them to survive, and then ultimately to teach to their own children. We, on the other hand, are born in ignorance, and we must struggle to learn this and that truth. This is not something that they dealt with. Perhaps they were the most intelligent humans who have ever lived, but nevertheless, we do consider them to be the exemplars of the human race. So then, how were they so easily tempted? Was there actually something faulty with human nature?
It must have already been pretty depraved for that decision to be made, and at the first opportunity, and at not very much convincing from the serpent.
No, as rational creatures, they had a free will. And to use that free will is not a disorder. It is to exist how they were created to exist. However, insofar as the free will chooses, there always exists the possibility that they would choose an incomplete good, something that is perhaps good for this moment, but then it does not endure towards their ultimate end. Now, if we presume a mechanistic view of man, it would be too easy to view the exercise of the free will as a malfunctioning machine or computer virus, so as to strip the term free will of all of its functional meaning and to simply give it lip service. To choose is what it means to be human, as to fly is what it means to be a bird, and this is not a malfunction. So then, how is it that they made a choice that was clearly so bad? It is important here to make this distinction. St. Thomas Aquinas teaches that there are three types of sins: sins of passion, sins of ignorance, and sins of malice. Now, because of this perfect ordering, this integrity that Adam and Eve were created in, we have ruled out sins of passions and sins of ignorance. So it was not a sin of the passions or a sin of ignorance. By process of elimination, we come to sins of malice. And this meaning is clearly present in the text, that this sin that they committed was actually an act of pride. It wasn't that they were ignorant or starving. They wanted what the serpent promised, to be like God. Not that they believed him, but that the thought was appealing to them, and they embraced it internally. And as soon as they did, that was a sin of pride. And it was at that moment that the fall had occurred, and the hierarchical order that was described, the waterfall, was blocked. The source of life was blocked. It was then that human nature was corrupted, because the hierarchical ordering has now been disordered. It is now that the lower passions are capable of overpowering the higher rational powers. I've heard it stated that as man rebelled against God, so his lower passions rebelled against his higher reasoning. So it is at that moment that they can now be tempted by cigarettes and alcohol, fast food and donuts. And that is precisely what we see in the text. Eve saw that the fruit was good for food, a delight to the eyes, and desired to make one wise. So first pride, then gluttony and lust. So to say that Eve was deceived, as it does in 1 Timothy chapter 2, does not mean that she did not know this or that. She knew. God told her. By pride, she chose to ignore what she had knowledge of. In the same way that we call someone stupid when they do something that they should have known not to do, like walking out in the street without looking or grabbing a hot pan. By stupid, we don't mean that they did not possess the knowledge of traffic or of heat. We mean that they neglected knowledge that they should have not neglected. This is sometimes called vincible ignorance, as opposed to invincible ignorance, which is how Alex seems to characterize Eve, as if she was beyond the ability of knowing that she should not eat this fruit. No, the text is clear. She knew that she should not eat the fruit of this tree because she quotes God's command verbatim, and not just the command, but also the consequence for breaking the command. Furthermore, I think it's important to also mention here what Dr. Scott Hahn has pointed out, that when God created Adam, he commanded him to till and to keep that garden, to protect it. And as you pointed out at one point in your video, how did this evil serpent get into this perfect garden? So here we have the possibility that Adam was being somewhat negligent in his duties, even prior to the sin. Because not only does the evil one gain access to the garden, but he also gains access to his wife. Worse yet, it seems as though Adam is present and witnessing this entire back and forth between Eve and the serpent. And he remains silent the entire time. He does nothing. He doesn't speak until later when God finds him and asks him, what happened? And then when he does finally speak up, he doesn't apologize for what he has done. He blames his wife, and then he blames God, all in one sentence. The woman that you gave me. He might have repented. The text here seems to suggest that God is offering him an opportunity for reconciliation, for contrition. But he is too prideful for that. He blames his wife after putting her in that situation, and he blames God. Don't overlook that point. If there was any confusion about his intentions or your argument that this was just an accident, here he has the opportunity to say, oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. It was an accident. I was having a bad day. I was hangry. Anything. But he was too prideful to do anything of the such. All he could do is blame God and blame his wife. What we don't accept from any child when they say, oh, he did it first.
But consider it punishment in the poetic sense that we are now suffering on account of it.
Which brings us to the argument that God is at fault for punishing all subsequent generations. First, To clarify, to say that all humans are guilty of original sin is not to say that we each individually are morally culpable for the singular act of Adam. He is morally culpable for that act. For him, it was his own personal sin. This language that we use to say that we're all guilty of original sin simply refers to the fact that the human nature that we have received is a fallen human nature that is easily tempted due to the disorders that I explained. It is in this sense that we are being punished for the sins of another. But God is not guilty for allowing that we who did not eat the fruit are punished for the sake of virtue. Ludwig Ott stated, "The lack of the gifts of integrity results in man's being subject to concupiscence, suffering, and death. These results remain even after the extirpation of original sin, not as a punishment, but as the means given to man to achieve the practice of virtue." So essentially, through this evil, a greater good is achieved, that man is able to work and grow in virtue. St. Thomas Aquinas explains that God may allow an evil to occur for the purpose of bringing about a greater good. We know this to be true because God brought about the incarnation, which is an infinitely greater good than had Adam not sinned. This is such an important point. Christians are not angry or bitter at Adam for this, even despite all the suffering, because through his sin, we gained the most precious gift, the incarnation, the second person of the Blessed Trinity. The story of Genesis, and on a side note, the story of Job, has to be read in the light of the gospel. Neither of them make sense independently on their own. They're essentially unfinished stories. It is in the gospel that they find their meaning and their fulfillment. I would highly encourage anyone to read the Genesis story side by side with the story of the Annunciation in Luke chapter 1, or the temptation of Christ, or the Last Supper, or the agony in the garden. Read and notice the parallels and reflect upon the gift that was given. Consider, really think about the fact that God might have just given up on us, just annihilated us from existence. But instead, he gave himself to us. Furthermore, and this is an extremely important point, God created Adam and Eve in the state of perfect justice and perfect holiness. And it was while they were in this state that God commanded Adam and Eve to be fruitful and to multiply. He did not create them in this perfect state and then instruct them to damage that perfection and then reproduce. His instructions were to be fruitful and to multiply this perfect justice and this perfect holiness. The fact that Cain was born without this perfection is not a fault of God's, because after the fall, and after the damage had been done, it might have been more prudent had Adam and Eve chosen to not reproduce and simply end the species with their deaths. So to blame God that you or I are born in disorder does not work for these reasons. And for one more, any person has the freedom to develop natural virtue and receive the grace of Christ through the sacraments to pursue sanctity. By the grace of God, to reorder the inherited disorder. And you might say, well, that's fine for me, but what about everyone else? Well, any person has the freedom to use their influence, let's say on social media, to tell everyone else about natural virtues and the sacraments, in hopes that they too might reorder this inherited disorder. I'm very curious how we got to this point in society to suggest that an individual in a position of legitimate authority is morally culpable for rightly exercising his authority by establishing laws, do this, don't do that. And the individuals who have clearly transgressed have some justification for their transgression, some means to be vindicated. Well, your rules don't count in these particular circumstances, in this case, because, well, I was tricked. Would that work on a local police officer who pulls me over for speeding? Oh, officer, I was tricked. My passenger convinced me that the posted speed limit was a lie. Alex, in your video, you stated,
We chose not to live in it, did we? I didn't. I don't remember making that decision. And in fact, I think if I had the decision now, I know what I would take. And that applies analogously too. I'd rather live in a state of grace.
Alex, don't miss the point. You have the choice now. You can choose to live in the Garden of Paradise, which is reconstituted in the Church of Christ. You can live in a state of grace. It is being offered to you.
Are humans born evil? Are we morally corrupted? Is there anything good about us, or are we destined to depravity? Now, the answer to this question has much to bear on who we are, why we're here, what is the purpose of this life, and how it is, if it is, that we can become better people at all.